So hello, everybody, and welcome to the virtual seminar series on Gaussian processes, spatiotemporal modeling, and decision-making systems. And thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm really excited to have everyone who's joining us today. My name's Alex Trennan. I'm a postdoc at the University of Cambridge and one of the organizers who's going to be hosting today. I'd like to thank my fellow organizers, Lisa Simonova, Jeff Pleiss, and Zi Wang for all the work in bringing together the speakers and hosting today's event and really putting this whole series together. And before we get started, I'm just going to make a few organizational announcements. The first is that we have a bunch of amazing speakers lined up for the coming weeks. So you should check out our website, which is gp-seminar-series in order to see the schedule. And yeah, check it out. You can join seminars via Zoom as long as you sign up to the Google group to receive the invite with the Zoom link, or you can watch on YouTube and then you don't have to do any registration. Seminars take place at 1600 UTC, and be aware that in the next couple of weeks, a number of time zones are going to shift due to daylight savings. So be on the lookout for this. If you're joining via Zoom, you're welcome to ask, use the raise your hand option to potentially ask the speakers questions, or you can type your questions in the chat, and it's up to the speaker to decide how to answer. And I will now hand off to Lisa, who will introduce the speaker for today. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much, Alex, and also welcome from my side, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Lisa, or Yelizaveta Semenova. I'm also one of the co-organizers of the seminar series. So today, we're taking a slightly novel topic to the seminar series. As you know, the title of the series is Gaussian Processes, Spatiotemporal Modeling, and Decision-Making Systems. So up till now, most of the talks were concentrated around the first chunk, the Gaussian processes theme. So today we start branching out and focusing into spatiotemporal modeling, whether it involves necessarily Gaussian processes directly or not. And it is my pleasure today to host the talk by Esther Rolf, which is dedicated to geospatial machine learning and spatial statistics. So Esther is currently a postdoctoral fellow within the Harvard Data Science Initiative and the Center for Research on Computation and Society. And she's also an incoming assistant professor of computer science at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She will start there in fall 2024, and congratulations on that, Esther. So her talk today will be on satellite imagery, machine learning, and geospatial modeling, challenges and opportunities. Once again, a very warm welcome both to Esther and all the participants. Esther, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa, for the intro. Could I just confirm quickly, at what time should I plan to stop speaking and do question or discussion time?
Because we're starting a little bit late, I think this is flexible. So feel it's up to you, more or less. There's no strong constraints on our end.
Okay. And I would just say also, if people have questions during the talk, please feel free to raise your hand or just speak up. It is possible that I won't see your questions if you just ask them.
Esther, if you'd like, we can monitor the questions and then we can read them aloud or interrupt you if you can't see them.
Yeah, that would be great. In the past, I've had some trouble seeing the questions while sharing.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, that's great. Then ask questions live in the chat if you have any. And I would just say if you have questions throughout, ask them throughout, and I'll try and remember to pause momentarily as we switch sections and at the end of the talk as well. And today I'm really excited to talk to all of you about kind of a trio of considerations in satellite imagery, machine learning, and geospatial modeling, and focusing on challenges and opportunities that I think would be interesting to this community in particular. So just to get started here, because I think it might not be top of everyone's minds like it usually is mine, I want to just briefly go over a user's perspective on what satellite imagery and machine learning and combining those two would look like. So thinking about the global amount of satellite imagery we have here, transitioning it through a machine learning model that in this user's perspective is already trained and developed and tested. And from that, we get a map of predictions based on these images. So here you see a map of predicted population density that I'll run through later in the slide deck. And this map of predicted values might be the endpoint in and of itself, or it might be input to some downstream policy decision or causal inference analysis. And as these type of models that you see here abstracted in this arrow become more and more promising, more and more accurate, and more used in real world consequential domains, it's going to be really important that we tailor these models specifically to satellite imagery so that the models we're getting out from a predictive standpoint are as accurate as possible, also as efficient as possible, and in a minute we'll talk about as accessible as possible, making this so that the communities and people that are most affected by these models can really have a hand in developing and critiquing them. Thinking a little bit more broadly about satellite imagery and machine learning as a domain, this is very distinct from a lot of traditional machine learning in that we're making predictions and models that apply over space. So there's a distinct opportunity here to leverage spatial structures specifically to enhance performance along all three of these dimensions that are in the green bullet. And lastly, it's incredibly important that we test and assess performance of these models in the real world use cases that we're intending to deploy them. And this will become a little bit more concrete as we go through some examples. But I bring up these 3 bullet points to kind of set the stage for the 3 different components of what I'll talk about today. So first, we'll go through kind of just satellite imagery and machine learning. What is it? What can you do with it? I'll highlight a tool that I built during my PhD called Mosaics, which is specifically a system meant to help generalize and make this type of technology more computationally accessible to a much wider set of researchers. I'll also show you how you can use that system and the data associated with it, which hopefully should be really, really simple. So stay tuned for that. And then in part 2 of the talk, we'll kind of go toward more general machine learning and opportunities to leverage spatial temporal structures in learning settings. I'll focus on a pretty simple method or baseline for incorporating structures like space or time, considering those as not a predictive feature, but as side information. And this will really be more of an evidence that there's opportunities for much more sophisticated yet still general ways to incorporate time and space in machine learning frameworks. And I'll conclude here with some of the specific challenges and opportunities when it comes to evaluating these models. It'll be clear, hopefully, by the time we get to this point, why we need to be evaluating geospatial models in the context of their geospatial use. And I'll talk about some of the current techniques in case anyone is wanting to break into this field. I think it's important to see these kind of evaluation methods from the outset. I also think there's a lot that this community can add to the conversation of how we evaluate geospatial machine learning. So with that, I'll dive into the first and probably by far the longest of the 3 parts, which is just satellite imagery and machine learning. So I'll give a really brief overview of the many, many things that are done in this space. And then I'll mostly focus on talking about this field at large through the lens of Mosaics, the tool that I've built. And I will then show you how you can use it if you're interested. And in particularly, I think this gives us an opportunity to really incorporate some of the spatial information into these satellite imagery and machine learning methods, making the imagery part of that a little more lightweight with Mosaics so that we can focus on leveraging that spatial information for future work. But just to start the stage here of satellite imagery and machine learning at large, I imagine there's many people kind of across the planet in different time zones in the call or listening at some future moment. And as we're all here globally, there's over 700 satellites orbiting the Earth, taking images with an abundance of data being collected every single day. And this abundant and passive data source can tell us a lot about the world if we can process it quickly and efficiently. And that's where machine learning can come in. So combining satellite imagery and machine learning together can help researchers and analysts monitor our world across many different domains, from real-time disaster response to long-term environmental monitoring, and even in some cases, informing global policy with fine-grained poverty estimates or crop yield estimation. So with all of these different application spaces, we also see that kind of training a machine learning model. Here you see a ResNet 18 model is just a placeholder example. Predicting any one variable involved with any one bullet point from the previous slide can be very costly, both in terms of the computation, storage, training, evaluating these models. And currently it's kind of limited by machine learning and geospatial machine learning, computer vision expertise. As a result, the models that end up getting produced for many research projects tend to be pretty domain specific. They're predicting one thing at a time. And to go and predict another variable, you kind of have to go back to the drawing board. But if you just take a look at what amount of information is conveyed in this single satellite image, this image tells us something about the percent tree cover in this region. It tells us something about the population, about the average income, house price, and the road length, and many more different variables. So the idea is if we can process this one image in a way that carries information about all 5 of these variables, and possibly even more variables that I haven't even thought of yet, we can share a lot of that computation and make this whole process much more efficient. So that's the underlying insight that our team leveraged in building Mosaics, which stands for multitask observation with satellite imagery and random kitchen sinks. I'll explain in a slide or two. But you can see here, it's one common set of imagery that gets translated into one feature matrix X here. So now each image on the left is a row of this matrix X. And this same matrix can be used to predict forest cover on the top or population density on the bottom. And I'll orient kind of the design and this diagram in terms of 3 design goals that we had for Mosaics. So the first of those is from a user's standpoint, we want this to be accessible. So the prediction step should be simple for users and computationally efficient. And so a user's side of this diagram is this 3 steps you see here. First, we assume that a user has some label values, say of forest cover in this example, in some locations, and then they can geographically merge those with the rows of this matrix that correspond to those locations. Step 2 is then to solve a linear regression for the weights beta here, something that's typically doable on a standard laptop. And then step 3 is to use these regression weights applied to the places where we have imagery and hence features, these black rows but we didn't have those original forest cover labels. And then we can use these predictions ex beta to fill in those prediction values for those locations. So really kind of 3 simple steps: a geographic merge, a linear regression, and a feed forward linear matrix multiplication for new predictions. This is really valuable because it comes hand in hand with a generalizability. This exact same process that generated forest cover labels for our first researcher can be used for a second researcher studying population density who has values in possibly completely different locations, but they're following the exact same procedure and still getting high fidelity predictions. And all of this is enabled by an algorithmic simplicity in how we are translating these images into this matrix X, which is an unsupervised embedding. Unsupervised meaning it's done completely agnostic of what these labels Y will be. And I'm about to dive into exactly what that is. So this is an example of that unsupervised embedding for one particular image, where we have our satellite image in the beginning, and what we're getting out is this feature vector X. And remember, this will now be one of those rows in the matrix as we have n images. But if folks are familiar at all with convolutional neural networks, you'll see a lot of the same building blocks here, just really put in a simple manner. So what we have is a really, really wide and shallow convolutional neural network, where the width is determined by the number of random filters or sub-patches of images from the training set. So these random filters are essentially initializing our wide and shallow convolutional neural network. And what we're going to do is we're never going to optimize the weights of that network. We'll take these random filters as the initialization, and we'll always feed forward. And so what this looks like when it comes to a prediction step is running each of these images through that process from the previous slide, which is now abstracted with this random convolutional feature arrow. And from that, we do that n times to get the n rows in this matrix. Then computing the regression weights is here just solving a least squares optimization with this feature matrix and the user supplied arrows. And here we're doing a ridge regression. So you see this penalty on the norm of the weights. What's important here is all of these arrows are pointing toward the optimization problem. If we wanted to, say, fine-tune a convolutional neural network or some other deep learning model, we would also be optimizing the weights in the model itself, which means we can no longer just process one matrix and call it a day. Every time we want to put in a new set of labels, we have to go all the way back to the imagery. What you get out of something like this is a much more expressive and complex model, though. And so we want to make sure that we're not focusing on efficiency with the Mosaics method at a huge cost in accuracy when it comes to these prediction tasks. So here you see the performance of Mosaics, our method in green, with a fine-tuned ResNet 18, kind of exactly what we saw in that previous slide. And this is predicting 7 different things. So predicting forest cover, elevation, population density. You can read them all. And we're comparing on the performance of R squared. So higher is going to be better, and we're going to be between 0 and 1. So generally, Mosaics is a few R squared points below the ResNet 18, which we expected. This is a simpler model. It's much less complex. But where this really gets contextualized is in terms of the training time. So each of these green bars took about 2 minutes on a laptop to run for Mosaics versus about 8 hours on an Amazon Web Services instance with a pretty big GPU. And that's assuming that you've already done all of the hyperparameter training. So there's immediately a big difference between accessibility here. Who's going to be able to prototype whether this method is useful, and what computational resources are going to be required to do that. So I would say marginally different performance in the big picture. I also want to highlight that not any unsupervised method gives you this kind of performance comparability with speed up. You see here the performance of a different unsupervised method, which is just pre-trained ResNet 152. And generally, performance is much worse than both Mosaics and the ResNet 18, though the timing would be similar to Mosaics here. So why can we find an unsupervised embedding? Not any one, but a specific one that would kind of increase efficiency so much? Well, a lot of these computer vision models are developed and tested on natural imagery, where you might have a different scale for the object in the image, you might have a different camera angle, whereas satellite images have this very nice consistency in scale and orientation. Basically, the size of a house in the image on the bottom left there is always about similar to the size of a house on the bottom right. And this can help explain why this wide and shallow network can actually be quite effective for these settings. So I want to also zoom in a bit to what these predictions actually look like. So we first start in the United States. Here you see on the left the forest cover labels across the US. This is % forest cover in each image. On the right, it's our predicted values. And on the far right, it's a spatially disaggregated plot of our predictions and the true labels, where these maps are actually aggregated up just to visualize. The predictions themselves are even finer grained than what you see here. Here's a similar map for population density and per household income. And when we look at all 7 of the tasks that we predict in this paper, it's actually kind of hard to see the maps because they're tiny. But what you can see is we're using the exact same method applied to these 7 different variables and data sets. And we can start to ask questions that kind of go into these meta research questions of, well, what types of things can we predict with RGB satellite imagery? And how much of the signal are we really getting out there about the ground truth variation? We also predict globally where the labels are available. So for forest cover, nighttime lights, population density, and elevation. And you'll notice even here, you can see some of these trends in prediction errors. For example, at really high elevation, it's hard to distinguish between super high and medium high elevation because everything's basically snow. So you don't get the variation in the imagery. You need to describe the variation in the labels. But by and large, we're getting pretty reasonable, at least near to half of the variation in the labels explained by our predictions across these tasks. There's significant.
May I please ask just a couple of questions very quickly. So first of all, when you compare 3 models, the Mosaic and 2 ResNets, so what's the difference between the 2 ResNets? And
here.
Yeah.
So the ResNet 18 and the ResNet 152 are different model architectures. That's one difference, but the main difference is that the ResNet 18 in blue here is fine-tuned with the label. So that model is kind of what we're seeing here, where we're optimizing all of the model weights within this architecture, as well as this last layer beta. The orange model here is more similar to Mosaics in that orange model, the weights are trained on a different data set, on the ImageNet data set, if you're familiar with that, and then applied directly to the satellite imagery, and only there the last layer is tuned, whereas in the blue model, the entire model is tuned.
Right, so the blue one is specialized and the orange one is not specialized.
Exactly,
okay,
and that is absolutely reflected in the performance.
Thank you. And so question again about training time. So you were showing now global maps. So in both cases, is the training happening on a global scale?
So for this map here, this is happening on the US scale. So there's even a subsample of training data from the US. So it's roughly 80,000 training points that are reflected in these two training times.
Okay,
So if you wanted to train on the global scale, it would just increase, right?
yeah.
The disparity here is even more stark then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for fielding the questions. I definitely cannot see them, so this is helpful. And please keep asking questions. I will try and have some more pause moments here too. Yeah, so as Lisa or someone in the audience's question mentioned, while global is a very different regime than predicting only in the United States, and there's several challenges to making that happen. The first is just a challenge of scale, right? The globe is big, so there's going to be more imagery. That's more images to store, more images to compute on during training and evaluation. Luckily, kind of the goal of Mosaics is that it's supposed to abstract a lot of that away from a user. And so I'll talk about this in a second, but trying to make that scale a lot easier for folks. Whereas these last 2 points are kind of going to be challenges for everyone. The idea that the distribution of labels in a global setting can be different in just one country. And importantly, depending on the image source, images can have different quality or some can be missing. For example, over military bases, imagery is generally not available. But at least in addressing this first challenge, we're hoping that by making this system available to everyone, we can actually make learning with global satellite imagery a lot easier. So what we now have available is a public API at simul.berkeley.edu. Simul is our abbreviation of satellite imagery and machine learning. Berkeley is where I did my PhD. And so the idea is that users like this researcher you see at the bottom of the slide, who have georeferenced data, perhaps collected in the field, perhaps from some other data set, they can query this API with their latitude and longitude locations for their data. And then we'll give back a matrix that gives this already processed imagery as a feature matrix. And now this is just a tabular data set that still carries a lot of the information that's in those satellite images in that X part of this matrix. So what does this look like? In case anyone is interested, you just go to simul.berkeley.edu. The first time you'll have to register, and then you can log in. And you can just upload a CSV of latitude, longitude values. You'll select which column is latitude, which column is longitude, and then click this little create feature file. And depending on how big your file is, in a matter of seconds to minutes, possibly hours, so CSV will show up in your My Files section. If it's easier to think about, you can also drag and click bounding boxes, and you'll get the imagery back for everything in those bounding boxes. I'd like to also highlight that on this website, there's a bunch of resources like tutorials currently in Python and R, as well as additional resources like links to the paper, slide decks, and a social impact statement describing how and why we designed Mosaics and what the intended use cases are and are not of this type of system. So
Esther, we have a question.
Yes, awesome.
Is there a way to reference at what time the processed satellite images were taken for each returned row?
That's a great question. So in this API, everything will be from 2019 Q3. So that's like August and the surrounding months. And so here, this is a single snapshot of that, that time for the globe based on imagery from Planet Labs. And we're currently working on having this be kind of an over time system. One of the big challenges there is if we're going to have multiple quarters or multiple years of imagery, that's just a lot of storage time. So if there's anyone with a use case that is more over time than over space, I would encourage you to reach out to me or to our team. Their email would be on the slide in just a second. And just we're kind of hoping to track what people would like to do with this sort of system and data and get a better sense of that before we go into all of these computationally heavy questions of actually making these features over every single time step that we possibly could.
There's one more question.
Great.
Can this service be used for natural disaster-based remote sensing, such as building damage assessment before and after an event? For example, before and after an earthquake in a region?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think possibly the previous question answers this a little bit, and that this API is only providing one time step of imagery. So for doing a before and an after, to use this type of method, you would want to actually go back to the imagery and get those two images, one before, one after, and then featureize. The other caveat here is all of the prediction tasks we're doing with Mosaics have one label, one Y value per image. And often in things like disaster response, what you're doing is you're trying to isolate the step of object detection of each individual building before and after to reference where was there a building before but not after. That's a place where we should send human intervention. Those type of models are just kind of a different type of model than what we're doing for Mosaics, which would tell you something about the total built area in an image, kind of one summary statistic per image. But that's a great question, and definitely kind of goes to this point that the field of simul applications and model types is much wider than what we're addressing with Mosaics, which is another important thing to consider when you think about how we can get huge computational gains. We've really focused on one part of that bigger satellite imagery and machine learning question.
Okay, I have one question for myself. So do those features, are they interpretable in any way?
Not really. There are ways to interpret them. And there's a bit of kind of explanation to that in the appendix to our paper, but one of the things you sacrifice a bit in this method and kind of many black box machine learning methods is that what you get out of this is kind of linear regression weights. And it's very tempting with a linear regression to say that that's an interpretable model because you're literally getting some weights are higher on some features than others. And that can give you a sense of kind of which of these random filters, here, I'll do the ambitious thing of going backwards in the slides. Which of these random filters is lighting up? So if we come back to this featureization step, what we've done here is we've taken really small random patches of the imagery, things like 3 pixel by 3 pixel patches. And each one of these random patches goes through this convolutional step, a nonlinearity, and then an average over pixels. And so each one of these elements of this feature vector, so each row in our regression matrix, corresponds to one random filter for all sample images, all n that we choose. So you can attribute the regression weight that you get, this d-dimensional beta, back to these individual random filters, and you can say, how much did this filter matter or that filter matter? And that can be tricky to look at in a 3 by 3 sub image, But you could look at the set of random filters that have the highest regression weight, and then look at the map of their feature responses. So here you see this feature is kind of basically acting like an edge detector. The spots that light up in the image are where there's a lot of edges. And so that gives you a little bit of interpretability and diagnostics. But I think there's a ways to go in making methods like these truly interpretable. And there's a question as to whether that should be done within the machine learning model or kind of around it. And I think we'll get to some of those points in the third part of the talk too.
Great. One last question from my side, I promise. So is there any effort to ensure the diversity of random filters? Because by chance, they might have been picked as being very similar or even identical.
Yeah, that's a great question. In our paper, we're just doing kind of a simple uniform at random sampling from images and then uniform at random sampling within image to get these filters. All is from the training data set. And you're exactly right that some of these filters may be very, very similar to each other. In terms of prediction, that's okay for us because of this ridge regression penalty here. But generally, you could imagine trying to sample for specifically diverse filters. We did a tiny bit of experimentation with that early on and didn't find a huge difference. But I think it would be a really interesting thing to go back to now that this whole project is more established and see if we could get similar performance or with just a subset of diverse features, kind of in a like optimal experiment design sense.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right, keep the questions coming. And this is a great summary. Now you can see quickly what we went through. API is available. Our wonderful expanded team that you see on the bottom here would love to hear from you if you have any questions about what can be done here. And then just to maybe like spark that creativity, I'd like to show one experiment here that really gets into some of these questions of spatial modeling. So if we zoom out a little bit and think back to the motivation of just studying satellite imagery and machine learning and creating these models in the first place, often these are most useful in settings where we have some training data available in some regions. So here, the white cell, where we have both imagery and some ground conditions in our variables y. But what we really want to do is use this model in a location where we have the satellite imagery, but we don't know what the ground truth conditions for y are. And this is a challenging thing to assess because how are we going to know if we're accurate in this black cell if we don't actually have the values with which to assess the accuracy of our predictions? So what we'll do is we'll kind of simulate this entire setting by splitting up the United States, where we do have data everywhere, into geographically disjoint training and evaluation sets. So basically saying, pretend we only had data in the white cells and we had to predict everything in the black cells. What would our performance look like? And to study this, we're going to systematically vary delta, which is here the width and height of these checkerboard cells. So as delta is getting bigger, the prediction problem is getting harder because essentially things in our evaluation set are farther on average from things in our training set. And you see what this looks like in the United States as we move delta from left to right on this plot. So for predicting forest cover, the R-squared performance remains pretty stable even as we go to delta equals 16, which you'll note there kind of the entire northwest of the United States is in the evaluation data, and the closest thing you really have is the southwest, and those are very, very different climates. If we compare to the 6 other prediction tasks that we look at, we see that some of these performance remains pretty stable with night lights and population density, and some like per household income and housing price performance drops pretty quickly as soon as you increase delta. And so the obvious and straightforward takeaway, I think, from this is that for many of these domains, incorporating location in our satellite imagery and machine learning models is going to help us both with predictive accuracy and possibly with this generalization or spatial extrapolation performance. And this brings us really to the first main opportunity that I want to highlight for everyone here, which is the opportunity to incorporate spatial modeling more in our machine learning methods, especially those with satellite imagery and remote sensing data, where this is just kind of a natural part of the problem setup. I would highlight to anyone who needs convincing how important these emerging applications are, as well as how important it is to get right how we incorporate spatial information when the use case is one of geographic extrapolation or predicting in a different area than you're training. And we'll come through this again and again in the next several slides. I would also say this is an exciting time to study this specifically with satellite imagery, because the Mosaics API makes this a lot easier. If you want to study spatial modeling for satellite imagery and machine learning, if you want to work with linear models in particular, Mosaics takes out a lot of the burden of the imagery part of the problem so that the innovations can be more on the spatial side. There are also several models that kind of are emerging that will do geospatial machine learning specifically for satellite imagery. Rather than go into the nuances of all of those, which maybe I could do at a future talk or something, I want to zoom back out to kind of, apart from just satellite imagery and apart from just location, what messages can we bring for spatiotemporal modeling in general machine learning? And so this will kind of bridge us to the second part of the talk, which will generalize beyond satellite imagery, but into more kind of general machine learning and how you might think about a first pass, including space and time there. But I'll take a little pause in case there are any questions specific to the satellite component. Great. So part two, which I think we'll go through a slight bit faster for sake of getting through everything and maybe having some discussion or after the talk question. But this is really taking a step back and looking at kind of simple ways that we can incorporate spatial or temporal information in machine learning. And why might we want to look at something simple? Well, what I'll call structural index variables, so think like time or space here, are often available with machine learning models or with data in particular. Sometimes they're just ignored completely because people don't really think they're going to be valuable or don't understand how to leverage them. And this is important because you can't just necessarily leverage this type of variable as a predictive feature and expect to have good out of sample performance. And I'll unpack that through these slides. And we'll look at one kind of simple way to use this side information, which is post-estimation smoothing. And we'll talk about kind of some nice theoretical and experimental results on this. So the setup here, though, is we're kind of in a standard supervised machine learning world. You have a feature matrix X. It could be Mosaics features. It could be things like health attributes of a person. You also have an outcome Y, or a label variable that you want to predict. And then rather than just having the indices of this matrix be like 1, 2, 3, 4, we have some kind of meaningful or structural index, like a location or a timestamp that we'll refer to as T throughout. And so this T column can carry a lot of important information generically for different tasks. So in this example here, we have frames from a video, and the prediction task is for each frame, you want to identify the human pose. So basically locate all the joints in the person. Here I've highlighted, I guess, the right elbow. And so these boxes are telling you where you should predict that elbow to be at frame 50, 30, and 70. And immediately you can see that T, which is the frame number in these video images, is going to give you a lot of information. If you know where the elbow is on frame 50, that should tell you a lot about where it is at frame 49 and frame 51. In a very different example, more similar to what we've seen before, if we're predicting the price of a house from attributes like number of bedrooms or square footage, it's very helpful to know where that house is located, because generally what you would do is rely on neighborhood effects and say, what is a similar house down the street sell for? That's kind of a good prediction. But a house well across the country or across the state may have a completely different base rate value for that neighborhood. So while this information is helpful, it can also be incredibly misleading if we just assume that the same trend that holds for the arc in this first video holds for the second one. The path of that elbow, while also smooth, has no parametric kind of bearing on what's going on in that second video. Similarly, if we wanted to predict houses in a neighborhood that we've entirely not seen before, the neighborhood average prices may or may not be helpful in these other neighborhoods. So our objective with post-estimation smoothing is to leverage these index variables in a way that is helpful, but is also reliable. So standard supervised learning would ignore T altogether and just give predictions Y hat that are a function of X. Post-estimation smoothing says, well, let's use these variables in a way that applies after that estimation step with a smoothing matrix, which is here S. And so with this very simple form, we can then kind of crystallize some of these main questions, including how to find a smoothing matrix X that will increase accuracy or reduce the mean squared error of our predictions while remaining robust to misspecification. Second question is, when is this specific type of use of spatiotemporal variables going to be helpful? And how does this very simple formulation compare to something more complex that would incorporate T directly into the prediction model? So replacing an f of X with a g of xt. So first, how to find a smoothing matrix that reduces the mean squared error. So we'll think of our predictions as kind of the true values Y over space or time, plus the error residual is epsilon here. And so we'll break up what we want out of S into two different terms here. So think of W as something akin to S. It's kind of getting our way there. We want this weight matrix where like the IJ entry of W is comparing instance I and instance J, the weights between those in this kind of locally weighted average. We want something that basically acts like a zero matrix on the errors themselves. That's what gamma is saying. When gamma is small, we're acting like the zero matrix on the weights, sorry, on the errors. Beta, on the other hand, is acting like an identity matrix on Y when it's small. So acting like an identity matrix on the true labels Y, yet a zero matrix on the errors. And formally, we can say that when the sum of gamma and beta is strictly less than 1, then we can always find a smoothing matrix that strictly reduces the mean squared error compared to our original predictions. And kind of one of the insights here is that if we don't take this W exactly, but we take a convex combination of W and the identity matrix, then we're also robust to this misspecification. So see here, this convex combination parameter is something that will eventually cross-validate over. And so if we choose a really terrible W, we thought that nearby things should have more similar values, for example, and it turns out not to be the case. Cross-validation should just eventually return C equals 0, just use the identity matrix and don't do anything. So that's a pretty simple way of getting that robustness to misspecification. I'll kind of go through this next part quickly, but just to understand when is post-estimation smoothing going to be helpful. Here we have two Gaussian processes, X and Y, both linked through this underlying process Z, but with different noise here with omega and mu. And so what you see here is the value of Y over time, and the color also denotes time. Y hat is the total least squares predictions using X as the independent variable and Y as the dependent variable. And then what happens when you apply this post-estimation smoothing is you're basically doing a local average of these Y hat values over T. So things are kind of getting smushed when they have similar value. You're basically doing the local weighted average by color. If we have a different parameters for these Gaussian processes, we see that the errors are also reduced, but not entirely. And this example is a nice illustrative one because we can compute exactly what the lower bound for smoothing is. And this is just a plot showing that here it depends, or the lower bound average MSE is dictated by the noise in the Y process, not the additive noise in the X process. I'll also kind of go, okay, so this is for this specific parameterization so that we can say something very crisp and formal, but this is similar results for more general distributions are in the paper. I do want to kind of show what this looks like in empirical results in these two application spaces that we motivated this section by, where kind of experimentally what using post-estimation smoothing requires is cross-validating over C in this convex combination. And here the weight matrix we're using is just this simple squared exponential kernel where we're also cross-validating over the width of this kernel. So for pose estimation in video, again, we're trying to track the joints, the many different joints of the human across the frames in this video. This is a well-established task with a lot of baselines, some of which you'll see here. So this is a method in gray that ignores any space and just predicts each frame completely independently, versus in purple, the smoothed version. And so throughout, as I add rows, the bold numbers will always be the best, whether that means higher or lower for each column. So always better to add post-estimation smoothing. Now compared to what at the time of publication was pretty state of the art for using temporal modeling, and temporal modeling plus physical knowledge of kind of human dynamics, still adding post-estimation smoothing to those methods can give like even a marginal boost from those methods that already include time. Now in house price prediction, where this is kind of more similar to the satellite imagery setup in that T is now location, but our features are like number of bedrooms and square foot, and we're trying to predict the price of a house. Here we're comparing not to state-of-the-art machine learning necessarily, but kind of older school semi-supervised learning methods. And the thing I want to highlight here is the very similar performance to this harmonic energy minimization method at a much, much faster training time. So we're, in this specific case, getting a lot of that structure incorporated just with this one post-estimation smoothing step. But now I want to bring us back to this idea of kind of incorporating this side information, this time or space variable is not so simple necessarily if you're not really thinking about what information that does and does not convey. So similar to the checkerboard experiment from before, now we're just splitting the training set as the top, the northern US, and the eventual test set or holdout pool will be the southern US. And so if we just had data from the north and we trained our model, tuned the hyperparameters, validated, a gradient boosted decision tree trained on just the house features gives us about a 0.5 R². Applying a post-estimation smoothing bumps that a little bit, but not a lot. But it looks really, really good to just add location in as a feature. A similar column to number of bedrooms, for example, would be latitude and longitude. But of course, this is going to fail miserably when we try to apply that model in gray to the southern US, because those trends that held in the north don't actually have bearing when we're going to a completely different location. In contrast, the gradient boosted decision tree trained only on attributes of the house does worse, but not disastrously worse than in the north. And post-estimation smoothing, the kind of modest bump there remains. And so what this is saying is there's kind of the form of structure is being captured better by this type of model than should we just put latitude and longitude in as features themselves. I think another important thing that we get from this plot and this experiment in particular is how important it is to look at the performance on a set like this if that's the way that we're going to be using these models, if that's where it's most valuable. And that will bring us to the second big opportunity that I want to share with you all, which is really about formalizing and rigorously designing these experiments by which to evaluate performance of geospatial machine learning. I would say, again, just to hit it home, both of these are especially important when we're doing geographic extrapolation. So applying our models in different places than we're training them. And I think it's especially challenging in that setting, which is why I raise it here. I'll pause in case any questions have accrued here. Otherwise, the third part of the talk should go pretty quick.
We don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay, sounds good. So part 3 here, we're going to talk about kind of why is evaluation hard. This has come up throughout the last several discussion points, but here we'll kind of unpack this into 2 challenges. One, which is about the many different things that people want to do with geospatial models. And the second being kind of structures in the data itself. So spatial autocorrelations and differential data coverage and quality across the globe and across time. And then I'll conclude with kind of 3 distinct opportunities just for evaluation. Oh yeah, this is kind of exciting, hot off the press work that I'll present this summer at the workshop on machine learning for remote sensing at iClear. And kind of a lot of these ideas are a synthesis of many different disciplines worth of work. Some disciplines caring more about map accuracy, some caring more about model performance. I think this is kind of a dichotomy that really helps us understand what these multifaceted goals look like. So you might say, okay, you gave me a map of predicted population density. Well, how well does that actually reflect the true population density across my country or across the globe? And to answer this, it's actually pretty strict what you need in terms of evaluation data. You usually need a very carefully collected probability sample that has high coverage. So think like a simple random sample of places in your region of interest, your country, or globally of ground truth population density. That's kind of, it doesn't have to be a simple random sample, but it does have to be a probability sample of those values by which to compute map accuracy as a meaningful and unbiased statistic. Model performance is kind of a more nebulous thing at the moment, but this would say, okay, you've given me a model that predicts population density. What can I do with that model? Can I spatially extrapolate to new regions where the model wasn't trained? Can I expect these outputs to be fair? How much training time and what computational resources should I expect to use? Because this is incredibly multifaceted, answering these questions means we first have to acknowledge and define what these axes are, and then design evaluation strategies to assess them. So we've been talking a lot about spatial extrapolation. So let's go into that one specifically. And so this idea we've seen before that geospatial machine learning is often valuable when it's filling in these substantial coverage or quality gaps that are available in many different sources of labeled data. Back to this idea of, we'll train in one region, and then what we really want to do is deploy it in this region that we don't have data. But if we don't have data there, it's very hard to assess whether our model is doing anything meaningful in the first place. So we have this kind of annoying chicken and egg cyclical problem. And so one way to address this is methods like spatial cross-validation that don't necessarily assess accuracy in that black box or that black region in the previous slide, but that assess the ability to do tasks like spatial generalization. So in the Mosaics component of this talk, we talked about this checkerboard experiment, but more generally, there's several different methods that I basically would categorize into spatial block cross-validation, similar to the checkerboard pattern, and buffered cross-validation, which is similar, but it will force a minimum distance between any train set and any test set point by basically throwing out some of the data to create that buffer. And then kind of expanding on those, there's ways to say, well, what if my buffer were bigger or smaller? What if my checkerboard were bigger or smaller? That help us understand when these models would be appropriate. And this brings us to kind of three opportunities for evaluating geospatial machine learning. The first being just investing in evaluation data to measure map accuracy as a statistic when that's what we want to do. Some recent and exciting advances here would be creating labeling tools that help people remotely annotate and ground truth these images, on the ground efforts to fill in data gaps with kind of creative data collection methods, and creating data sets that specifically simulate real world prediction conditions like domain shift or geographic extrapolation. Some people are going to be able to collect data to create data collection methods. Some people are going to be better suited to develop and really establish rigorous evaluation frameworks. So if folks are familiar with model cards, this is a concept that kind of applies to general machine learning models, saying what the model was designed to do, what data it's trained on, when it should and shouldn't be used. There's a big opportunity, and I would say a need, to develop the niche geospatial model of geospatial version of that specifically adds or removes some of these questions of what needs to be reported as a model comes out. A big part of that, and a kind of more, a lot of room for technical innovation here, is in delineating areas or regions of applicability. So in addition to training a model, saying, these are the regions where I believe my model will be accurate or will be fair or any of these notions. And in these red regions, I just don't know. I can't guarantee that for you. Kind of with any machine learning project, whether it's about the data or the evaluation or just the predictions themselves, anyone can explain the limitations and the types of performance that are being evaluated. And as a very concrete thing for folks, I think distinguishing between performance measures that are meant to estimate a statistical parameter, is your R squared actually meant to be a statistic that measures something about a certain population? Or is that just an indicator of potential skill for something like a task of spatial extrapolation? So in conclusion, there's 3 opportunities here. The first 2 are more kind of research community level. And the third is really kind of each individual project. This is more about explaining what you've done to your audience so that people are using your work appropriately. And then in full conclusion, now taking the big step back, we talked today about satellite imagery and machine learning opportunities to develop models with mosaics or without that use spatiotemporal structure. And then looking more broadly at spatiotemporal structures and their kind of relevance in general machine learning, as well as challenges of specifically evaluating models that have this type of structure. And so to highlight the main 2 opportunities here, the first was in modeling, where I think especially for this community, some of the orienting questions could be around what are those simple baselines that we should be using? What are those best practices? And what are potential pitfalls? And the second opportunity around evaluation, how do we delineate model applicability? How do we describe the uncertainty and the usefulness? And while I imagine there are many ideas in this room, I also would add that mosaics can be a really helpful tool for looking at either of these specifically in the satellite imagery context. And if folks have questions about any of these, but specifically using mosaics, I would totally be happy to help there. And with this is, I'll leave it on this slide as the kind of summary for everything if people have any questions.
Great, thanks a lot. Let's see if we have any questions. So if anyone still has some questions unanswered, please type away or raise a hand.
I also want to just note that at some point we will pause the YouTube live stream. So if anybody has any more controversial questions, then you're welcome to wait until that point in time, if you prefer.
So since there's no questions, I think let's stop the recording now.
All right, then I have a short concluding announcement to make. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we will now conclude the live stream, and I wanted to thank all of our listeners on YouTube who joined us today. And just to remind everybody that we have another seminar coming up next week. So you can check out the schedule on our website, which is gp-seminar-series.github.io. And